This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It's Friday, February 6th, 2026. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio ahead of another big storm. I hope all the listeners are safe and comfortable and warm. I'm here in my office having just received a communication from the Maine um, Lawyers for the Rule of Law. And that's what this podcast is about. It's the Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law, me being one of them, and Trump derangement syndrome and how it infects even some of the best organizations. So I'm a lawyer here in the state of Maine. I have been a lawyer for a long time. I'm a member of a number of organizations: the American Bar Association, the Maine State Bar Association, the Maine Employment Lawyers Association, the Maine Trial Lawyers Association. I'm about to join the newly reformed Maine Federal Bar Association. I practice law in federal and state court, mostly federal court. I've had cases, most civil cases. I don't do criminal law. I don't do domestic violence. I represent whistleblowers. I represent a lot of federal employees. And I signed on to the Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law Declaration when it was first circulated back around Law Day, which takes place on May 1st, I think. And the Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law organized in response to a call from the United States Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, who called on bar associations and lawyers to defend federal judges who are under attack in the political sphere, right? Of course, our president, Donald Trump, leads the pack. He made some really, I think, inappropriate remarks in response to some decisions early on in his administration, especially around the issues of immigration. So, there was a declaration that was circulated to Maine lawyers to show support for the rule of law. And the declaration, like I said, I signed on. And the declaration said, "We, the undersigned Maine law firms and lawyers, stand united in supporting the fundamental principles of our legal system, including the right to counsel, the independence of the legal profession, and the rule of law." And it went on. It's just a 3-paragraph thing. Our justice system is premised on the principle that all individuals and entities, regardless of their political, social, or economic standing, are entitled to representation. And it goes on to talk about this foundational principle is so important. And it calls on all branches of government to support the rule of law and the essential role of lawyers in our democracy, and to reject any efforts to use the tremendous power of the government against members of the legal profession for performing their duty. So, I mean, sign me up, right? Of course I signed up. And I've shown support for the rule of law. I continue to show support for the rule of law. I mean, I took an oath to uphold the Constitution for the state of Maine and the United States. I'm, of course, admitted in state and federal bars, and so all lawyers who are admitted to practice in state and federal court have to do that, right? You raise your right hand, you swear to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the state and of the United States. And so here's the rub. The Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law, unfortunately, I think has come down with a little touch of Trump derangement syndrome. And what I mean by that is, this trans ideology has is really infected all corners of life. It's permeated society, right? We're constantly talking about gender identity, this very loose, um, I think, crazy term that has been defined in law to mean, in Maine law, gender identity means the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's assigned sex at birth. So yes, that is a legal definition in the Maine Human Rights Act. It was added, I think, in just a couple years ago. There was nobody really who came forward to complain that they had been discriminated against on the basis of gender identity. It was just the cause du jour of progressives. It came down from high, including in the Biden administration, right? Some people think that it's Trump's executive orders on transgenderism are a new thing, but in fact, it was the Biden administration who really caused this whole problem by inserting itself in by way of executive order, saying that gender identity and sexual orientation should be protected at all levels of government, not just in Title VII employment situations like the Supreme Court said, but in all federal programs, including Title IX. So it was the Biden administration that first opened up Title IX to this new interpretation that even though Title IX says there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex in athletic programs funded by the government, or if there is, there's no funding to these programs. So even though the Title IX specifically refers to preventing discrimination on the basis of sex, Maine law adopts this gender identity, which essentially overrides it because you can't have both. You can't have protection on the basis of sex and have a law that says any man at any time can declare himself a woman and be granted all the privileges and rights of women. That's why gender identity is in conflict with the protections on the basis of sex. So, much to my chagrin, I received a communication from the Maine lawyers for the rule of law. And the latest thrust is no longer are we just fighting for people's rights to representation, regardless of their political views. And no longer are we just sticking up for federal judges who are putting their neck out there doing their job. But now we're going to have a YouTube show. And I'm thrilled that the host is going to be former State Senator Roger Cates, who I had the pleasure and honor of serving with in the Maine Senate. And he's a great guy, and I'm hoping that he can come up with some sports analogies for me, because that's one thing he was very good at when we were working together in the State House, and it's one thing I'm not good at. But since we're talking about Title IX and discrimination against women on the basis of sex in sports, I'm thinking Roger Cates is the guy who's going to come up with some analogies. So we got this communication, and the Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law are going to have a YouTube show. State Senator Roger Cates is going to be the host. They're going to first talk about how the Trump administration has failed miserably to uphold the laws, civil rights and otherwise, of immigrants, right? The whole ICE crackdown and the excess in the administration's enforcement. I mean, we see it everywhere. I've talked about it. Everybody is in agreement that, ICE has gone rogue. The United States Congress, believe it or not, came together to separate ICE funding from the rest of the funding bills that were recently passed to prevent a government shutdown. But the ICE, reforms are on the ropes. The Democrats want, no masks, body cameras, a complete overhaul, training. The Republicans agree in many respects for reform is necessary, but I think for the most part, the American people are relieved that the ICE operation seems to be winding down. Even Trump has acknowledged that he needs a little soft pedal this, a bit. They've gone overboard with ICE, and that's good. And I think that's going to be a good topic of a show for the Maine rules. The Maine Lawyers for the Rule of Law. A lot of Maine lawyers have stood up for these immigrants, are representing them in cases, are helping them to just be safe, explaining their rights, harboring some of them, I think, sheltering them, taking steps to do within the law what they can to protect the rights of immigrants, and I'm all for it. I'm all for it. What I'm not all for, though, is this. So the first show is going to be about the ICE excess tactics. The second show is going to focus on the administration's unlawful attempt to withhold from Maine federal funding of school lunches in retaliation for the Maine governor, Governor Mills, standing up for Maine's law on transgender athletes. So this is my problem here, is that there seems to be an attempt to kind of say that the administration's excessive and what appears to be blatantly unlawful tactics of ICE officers on the ground in Minnesota, obviously with the shooting deaths of Alex Preddy, and they're suggesting that is on par with the Trump administration wanting to protect women and girls from discrimination on the basis of sex. And this is, I object. I object as one of the main lawyers who want to uphold the rule of law to, first of all, put these two things on par, and second, to assume that somehow when it comes to protecting women and girls, there's been an attack on the rule of law. So this particular case that it talks about is a case that was, it. I think it was broadcast in the news. Maine has adopted gender identity laws in the Maine Human Rights Commission, unfortunately, and without a lot of fanfare on how that would harm women and girls. That gender identity now is permeated into all laws, including education laws. So schools now are under a state law that says they can't discriminate against kids on the basis of their gender identity when it comes to administrating education programs, including athletics. So in Maine, you have this horrible situation where there are boys who can just identify as a girl and be granted have the legal right to play on the teams, have access to private spaces, and it does result in discrimination against women, I would argue, and I think the courts will, eventually agree with me, because women and girls are denied the equal opportunity to participate in athletics when, on the basis of sex, if a boy can become a girl and then play and have, an unfair advantage, or if a boy without the girl's consent can access private spaces. It's an assault, in my opinion, in a lot of people's opinion. So it's discouraging to me that we would get a communication from the main rule lawyers for the rule of law suggesting that the governor standing up for transgender athletes is somehow on par with sticking up for the rights of immigrants when it's not. Okay, it's not the transgender athletes who are being discriminated against in Maine. It's the girls. Okay, the transgender athletes have an opportunity to play sports on the basis of sex, like all other kids. So the discrimination here is just against girls because when boys identify as girls and have access to girls teams, they take all the victory, or they take a spot on the podium, or they're just there and the girls have to, like, pretend that they're a girl when they're not, and they have to allow them in the locker room and in the bathrooms, and that's in violation, I believe, of girls' rights to privacy, dignity, safety, and their rights under Title IX, which, I think most lawyers would agree that federal law takes precedent over state law. So there's a conflict here. There's a conflict that needs to be talked about fairly, taking into account equally the rights of women and girls and the rights of these poor transgender athletes, these pampered group of boys who I guess can't be told that, hey, fellas, the rules are going to apply to you the same way they apply to the girls. You have two sexes, sex is binary. We can talk until the cows come home about gender and on a spectrum. I agree. Gender is on a spectrum. Gender nonconformity should be accepted. But the answer to gender nonconformity is not the medicalization of it, right? If you're a girl and you like trucks, it doesn't mean you need a mastectomy. If you're a boy and you like to play with dolls, it doesn't mean your puberty needs to get blocked. If you're a boy and you want to play on the girls' teams, that too bad. If you're a boy and you identify as a girl, you can identify as a girl all you want and play on the boys' teams. Separate sports on the basis of sex because there's a rational basis. It allows for girls to have athletic competitions. It allows for girls to participate in sports on an equal playing field as boys, to have an equal opportunity to get those scholarships, to get that recognition, okay? To be on a team that's divided by sex. There's nothing wrong with dividing human beings on the basis of sex. Sex is binary. So this idea, this notion that in our law in Maine, we're creeping into this weird, weird space where we're going to put in the law sex assigned at birth. Sex isn't assigned at birth. You know, babies' DNA and their chromosomes, the second they're conceived, there's XX chromosomes for females. We have different reproductive systems. There's XY chromosomes for males and boys. They have different reproductive systems. That is a biological reality. And so the talk about gender identity and this talk about discriminating against these transgender athletes mostly by, unfortunately, I think men and this far left, they've lurched so far left that they can't even admit that there's a biological difference. And thank God, right? Thank God we're, I think, slowly coming out of this nightmare, because just this week we had some, some glimpses of reality setting in. Some people being able to separate themselves from their Trump derangement syndrome. Just because Donald Trump's administration supports, the rights of women, girls, doesn't mean that's bad. Just because Donald Trump agrees with the majority of, like, thinking sentient beings that there are two sexes doesn't mean he's wrong. This week, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, right, the Academy, came out finally and said, you know what? There's no evidence to suggest these irreversible surgeries on children, including mastectomies, phalloplasties, vagioplasties, these weird, creepy surgeries that these doctors have been performing and on our kids. And don't tell me that there haven't been mastectomies on young girls, because it has just been reported. There's been like 4,000 in the last, maybe it's 100 or so. I don't know. Maybe it's 500 a year. 500. I mean, if there's 4,000 girls between the age of 12 and 16 in the United States have had mastectomies based on this gender identity nonsense, and now the Academy is coming out and admitting, you know what, folks, we don't have any basis to believe that there's going to be a long-term benefit for these irreversible surgeries, so we're going to stop recommending that they take place. And the American Medical Association finally, somebody's like realizing, wow, the emperor has no clothes, and saying, oh, yeah, as a matter of fact, the American Medical Association, we think that that's probably a good idea, good idea too. Oh, and guess what? There's really no evidence. There's been no experiments. There's been no studies of the efficacy of cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers either. And this is what we are promoting in Maine to kids without their parents' consent, and then giving legal immunity to all the purveyors of this gender affirming care on kids. Crazy, 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 crazy. So the American Society of Plastic Surgeons came out and said, yeah, let's stop doing this. There was a $2 million verdict out of Westchester, New York. Okay, not exactly Trump country. $2 million against doctors who performed a double mastectomy on a girl, because and her parents went along with it, and they won the lawsuit because they convinced a jury that they were told falsely that unless they went along, consented to this radical surgery that will never be reversed, this child is forever without breasts, can never breastfeed, is permanently maimed. The parents were convinced by those medical people responsible for this tragedy that unless they were able to do the surgery, she'd commit suicide. That's the kind of emotional blackmail this gender ideology complex, okay? This scam, this horrendous scandal that is just harming our kids when it comes to medicine, but in athletics as well. So, Maine lawyers for the rule of law, let's kind of rephrase that, and maybe it's not about governor standing up for Maine's law on transgender athletes, because that's exactly, like, not exactly what she did. Janet Mills told Donald Trump that she would comply with state and federal law. Well, that's going to be hard because they conflict. And then she said she'd see him in court. That's not exactly a full-throated, like, support of transgender athletes. And I support the rule of law. Okay. And so does Judge Woodcock, who was appointed by George W. Bush. The case in Maine that we're going to talk about, I guess, the Maine lawyers for the rule of law, that is characterized as retaliation for the governor withholding Maine federal funding of school lunches in retaliation for the governor standing up. Well, it's true that the Trump administration acted ridiculously. Okay. Donald Trump was perfectly appropriate in coming out with his executive orders on boys playing in girls sports and two sexes. Perfectly appropriate, consistent with every other president who's talked about this issue. Joe Biden, upended Title IX, gutted women and girls' rights with the stroke of a pen when he signed the executive order expanding, you know, gender identity to all federal programs, including Title IX. Okay, Joe Biden started it. Donald Trump did an executive order, I think, correctly, uh, you know, rolling that back. No, two sexes. Title IX is to protect girls and women opportunity in sports so no boys and men can play on women and girls teams or you don't get federal funding. It's perfectly appropriate. But what the Trump administration did under its Secretary for Agriculture, which is Brooke Rollins, after this little imbroglio down in Washington that was on TV and I'll see you in court, then the Trump administration did essentially attempt to claw back funding in response to the state of Maine refusing to, separate athletic facilities and sports opportunities on the basis of sex. For Maine's blatant, like I think, disregard of the protections on the basis of sex, uh, but they didn't follow the procedure. Judge Woodcock, it wasn't an abuse of the rule of law. It actually is an example of the rule of law working. Um, so the Trump administration didn't follow the procedure that's stated in the law that says you have to have notice and a hearing and you have to give a report to Congress if you're going to claw back funding in response to someone not, you know, in enforcing Title IX. Okay, there's ways to enforce Title IX. There's a recipe that you have to follow. It's regulated. Okay, there's a process, and the process is spelled out in the law. And the Trump administration, not surprisingly, didn't follow the process. Okay, that's bad, and so they did not win. The judge here in Maine, Judge Woodcock, an esteemed Maine federal judge, like I said, appointed by George Bush, went to Bowdoin. I think he went to the London School of Economics. Uh, he's no progressive firebrand, that's for sure. And he's no Trump. You know, uh, he's not a bootlicker of the Trump administration. He found that the Trump administration violated the law because it did not follow the proper procedure when it withheld funding for food, for school lunches in Maine. Um, that's the right outcome. That is the absolute right right outcome. But what the decision did not do was discuss at all the merits of the underlying issue, and that is at the nut of this. And this is what I want the Maine lawyers for the rule of law to focus on: is gender identities discriminate against women and girls because they erode protections that otherwise we have on the basis of sex. This is it's an incredibly important legal issue for women and girls, and it really, um, I I can't help but think that there's a little bit of maybe misogyny is too strong of a word, but it seems to me that there's never really a focus on the impact on women and girls, like this communication, like the transgender athletes that are, I think, correctly being treated fairly when they're treated like everyone else, that they have to play on teams on the basis of sex. There's going to be an Olympic event, and thankfully, there's a transgender athlete who's just going to play on the team that matches their biological sex because that's what's fair. That's what's fair. So, Maine lawyers for the rule of law. Here is just one of your signatories raising their hand saying respectfully, it's time that we have a serious talk about the conflict that Maine law presents when it comes to protecting the rights, dignity, privacy, and safety of women and girls. It's time to have a conversation about, this false notion that sex can change, that biology is mutable, that there's something unfair about acknowledging the reality of the female sex. There's nothing oppressive or discriminatory about acknowledging the reality of women and girls. So this idea that somehow we have to erase from our society, from our culture, institutions and language that celebrate and acknowledge and describe the unique experiences of the female sex is is dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous. And so, if we're gonna have a society where, um, there's no difference under the law, there's no protection under the law on the basis of sex, then that's not a step forward. That's not the oath that I took as a lawyer. So I am not going to, support this effort by a lot of my colleagues here in the state to protect gender identity laws. I am going to work, in in until I can stop working to repeal gender identity laws. They s no basis in a civilized society should we have a law that is so arbitrary, okay? Like I said, gender identity is the most loosey-goosey, subjective. You can identify as a girl, you can identify as a boy, you can identify as a eunuch, as I said in an earlier show, and I'm not kidding, okay? The standards that that supposedly dictate the boundaries of what a gender identity is includes as an acceptable one, a eunuch. So think about that. That's what we're protecting here in Maine. This transgender ideology has gotten so extreme that people have lost their heads. And what I'm afraid is gonna happen, because I see it happening with the Maine lawyers for the rule of law, is instead of focusing on the rule of law and the rights, competing rights of groups, instead of focusing on the rights of women and girls compared to the small number of boys and men who, want I guess have a feeling that they are born in the wrong body. Maybe they do. Maybe they want to express themselves as women and girls. I'm all for it, but that doesn't change the biological reality of their sex, and it doesn't give them the right to invade in spaces of women and girls and play on women and girls teams. Trans women are men. Trans women are not women. Women, female are adult women, and girls are juvenile females. I mean, we have to keep things straight. Maine lawyers for the rule of law. I look forward to a robust discussion um, about where we're at really, and not just lump together the Trump excess when it comes to ICE, and not just lump together people's, rage over a president who they can't get their arms around, who's driving everybody crazy because it's an ongoing show, it's the Trump show, and and so they just wanna lump everything that he's doing together. But this issue of protecting women and girls sports and protecting the dignity and biological reality of the female sex in law is something that the Trump administration is doing right. And so, let's not lose sight of that. Let's, not lose the forest for the trees, right? Women and girls are the most marginalized group across the globe and throughout the ages. And there needs to be protections in law on the basis of sex, and Maine lawyers, I would hope, are gonna stand up for women and girls and the rights that we have fought so long for, that we in the United States, thank God, we do have laws that protect women and girls, or at least we did. They're eroding. We are losing ground when it comes to protecting the rights of women and girls, and it's just, it saddens me that so many of my colleagues are behind this effort, and I welcome the debate, and I don't wanna be canceled because I'm saying something that's unpopular, because it seems to me that these law organizations, are doing a disservice to their members by making a huge assumption that Maine's law about gender identity is somehow the moral high ground, that somehow that's the civil rights we should be striving for. I disagree. I object. Okay? Go back to that hearing when gender identity was added to the law. There wasn't a single person who came forward with a compelling story about some travesty that occurred because their gender identity was not recognized. Okay? Maine lawyers for the rule of law, let's have an open debate. Let's discuss the merits of gender identity laws and whether they, in fact, conflict with Title IX, and whether they discriminate against women and harm kids. That's what I believe that they do. That's what I believe the United States Supreme Court, I hope, will uphold to be the case. And in the meantime, I certainly will continue to protect federal judges from being unfairly attacked for their stance. And I support Judge Woodcock fully in his decision, uh, telling the federal government they had to stop withholding funds. They could not withhold funds because of the belief that Maine is not complying with Title IX. Okay, because they didn't follow the process. That's what he said. Yeah, you blatant. There's a process in law. You didn't follow it. But what he didn't say was that the Trump administration is wrong in interpreting Maine's law as being a violation of Title IX. And when the case does get to him, if it gets to him, I'm confident that he's going to render a fair and just decision. But until then, let's have a robust argument and not just assume that because Trump supports women and girls, that somehow like the legal profession should stop supporting women and girls. And that's it. That's it for today. This is Cynthia Dale signing off. Subscribe to the show.